What if the coldest heart in Manhattan's boardrooms was broken open not by a billionaire's rival, but by an 8-year-old orphan who whispered, "You calculated wrong. Your fortune will be gone in 2 years." If stories of redemption, hidden genius, and found family touch your heart, please consider subscribing and staying with us until the last chapter of this journey. Jonathan Reed had always believed that numbers told the only truth worth trusting. At 38, the CEO of Reed Tech was known across Manhattan for his precision. The man who could read a balance sheet like a priest reading scripture. His boardrooms gleamed with glass and steel, his decisions bent markets. Yet on a chilly November morning, as he stepped into the orphanage hall in Brooklyn, numbers were about to turn against him, not in spreadsheets but in the clear, trembling voice of a child. The orphanage, St. Mary's Home for Children, smelled faintly of chalk and disinfectant. Wooden pews lined the hall where a modest podium had been set up for Jonathan's visit. He hadn't planned this stop. His assistant had suggested it as a good PR opportunity. Reed Tech had just closed a successful quarter, and Jonathan's reputation as a ruthless technocrat needed softening. So here he was, in a place with peeling paint and flickering fluorescent lights, his tailored navy suit sharply out of place among threadbare sweaters and second-hand shoes. Helen Moore, the 45-year-old director of the orphanage, greeted him with practiced warmth. "Mr. Reed, thank you for coming. The children are excited to meet you." Jonathan gave a polite nod, already glancing at the notes his assistant had prepared. The speech was brief. A few words about education, opportunity, and the importance of believing in oneself. He spoke them with the mechanical cadence of someone who had delivered 1,000 such remarks. His eyes skimmed over the crowd of children, faces eager, some wary, some simply bored. And then, in the back row, he noticed her. Emma Parker sat small and still, her brown hair falling in uneven strands around her face. She looked no older than 8, yet her gaze was unsettlingly steady, as though she were measuring the man behind the podium rather than marveling at the billionaire before her. She clutched a battered notebook on her lap, her fingers stained faintly with graphite. After the speech, Jonathan's assistant opened the floor for questions. A few children asked timid things, what cars he drove, whether being rich meant he never had to eat broccoli. Jonathan answered with indulgent smiles. He was already preparing to leave when a quiet voice rose from the back. "Sir," Emma said, not quite raising her hand but standing nonetheless, "your projection is wrong." The room hushed. Helen's eyes widened. The other children snickered. Jonathan frowned, lowering the papers in his hand. "Excuse me?" Emma stepped forward, notebook pressed against her chest. "On page 3 of your slides, the growth curve is based on linear demand, but the market for your software is already at saturation in North America. If you don't adjust for declining adoption, your cash reserves will run out in 2 years. For a moment, Jonathan thought he'd misheard. Then the silence in the hall pressed in. Dozens of children stared at the girl who had just accused one of the most powerful men on Wall Street of making a basic error. Jonathan cleared his throat. "That's a bold statement. And how, may I ask, did you come to that conclusion?" Emma opened her notebook. Inside were pages filled with calculations, hand-drawn graphs, equations, annotations in neat block letters. She pointed with a pencil, her voice steady. "You assume 10% growth each year, but the adoption curve is already flattening. If you model it logarithmically, with declining marginal users, the revenue slope bends downward. It's here." She tapped a line drawn in pencil, sharp and precise. "By the end of 24 months, expenses will exceed revenue." The assistant coughed nervously. Helen rushed forward. "Emma, that's enough!" But Jonathan raised a hand. His pulse quickened, though he masked it behind a veneer of corporate calm. He looked at the girl's notebook again. The graphs were messy, but the logic was correct, frighteningly correct. He had paid consultants millions to run forecasts that had never mentioned this. "Who taught you this?" Jonathan asked quietly. Emma's eyes flickered, almost shy for the first time. "No one. I read math books in the library." A ripple of laughter came from the children. Some jeered, "Emma the nerd!" Others whispered in disbelief. But Jonathan didn't laugh. For the first time in years, he felt something shift inside him. Something like awe, tinged with unease. This little girl, with her patched sweater and scuffed shoes, had just spotted a flaw that entire departments of Reed Tech had overlooked. The assistant tugged at his sleeve, whispering, "Sir, we should go." Jonathan ignored him. He crouched slightly, meeting Emma's gaze. "What's your name?" "Emma Parker." "Well, Emma Parker," Jonathan said, his voice slower now. "You may have just saved a company worth billions from making a very expensive mistake." Gasps rippled through the hall. Helen looked torn between pride and fear. Fear of overstepping. Fear of what this moment might mean for Emma's fragile place in the orphanage. Emma, however, simply hugged her notebook tighter. She hadn't spoken for recognition. She had spoken because she couldn't bear to see numbers twisted wrong. For her, truth was truth, whether spoken to a teacher, a friend, or the CEO of Reed Tech. Jonathan straightened, his expression unreadable. "Thank you for pointing that out," he said to the hall, though his eyes lingered on Emma. "It seems today I learned something important." As the children were ushered out for lunch, Jonathan remained rooted by the podium. For the first time in a long while, his certainty wavered. He had come here for a photo opportunity. Instead, he had been confronted by an orphan with eyes too sharp for her age, who had revealed a crack in the fortress of his empire. And deep down, beneath the pride and the calculation, Jonathan Reed felt something he had not allowed himself in years. The faint, dangerous stir of curiosity. The late afternoon light spilled across the cracked windows of St. Mary's Orphanage, painting pale golden stripes on the dormitory walls. Rows of iron beds filled the room, each covered with thin, mismatched quilts. Children's laughter echoed down the hallway, some loud, some mischievous, some edged with loneliness that laughter couldn't quite hide. Emma Parker sat on the edge of her bed with her battered notebook open on her lap. The pencil in her hand danced quickly, her small fingers smudged with graphite as she scribbled lines of equations across the page. She wasn't doing homework. There was none for her to complete tonight. She was building her own problems, equations that leapt in her mind like sparks, each solution leading to another question. A sudden shout jolted her. "Hey, Emma the robot!" One boy jeered from across the room. His name was Kyle, 12 years old, loud and restless, always looking for someone smaller to taunt. "Why don't you stop writing numbers and play like a normal kid?" Another chimed in. Emma lowered her head, but she didn't answer. Words slid off her when they came from cruelty. Still, the sting landed. She pressed her pencil harder, as if solving one more problem could drown the ache of being different. Helen Moore, the orphanage director, watched from the doorway. Her heart ached. She had run this place for 20 years, long enough to see how the world treated children who didn't fit into neat boxes. Emma was brilliant, so brilliant it frightened even Helen sometimes, but brilliance made enemies among children desperate to belong. That evening, when the noise had softened into the quiet hum of bedtime, Helen entered the room with a gentle smile. She sat on the edge of Emma's bed. "You were brave today," Helen said softly. Emma blinked up at her. "Brave?" "Yes," Helen replied. "It takes courage to tell the truth in front of so many people, even when they don't want to hear it." Emma hesitated. "Did I make trouble?" Everyone laughed. Helen brushed a strand of hair from the girl's face. "You made them uncomfortable, yes. But sometimes, Emma, the truth does that. And the man you spoke to, Mr. Reed, he noticed. That matters. Emma closed her notebook slowly. He looked at me like I wasn't invisible. Helen's chest tightened. That was Emma's deepest wound, not hunger or loneliness, but invisibility. Too often adults overlooked her, dismissing her sharp mind as precocious nonsense. I want to tell you something, Helen said. When you first came here, you could barely read, but you taught yourself. You devoured every book in our library, even the ones I thought you'd find too hard. You've taught yourself music too, haven't you? Emma's lips curved into the faintest smile. The old piano in the chapel, I learned scales from a library book. I can play Mozart now, not perfect, but... She shrugged, suddenly shy. And the languages? Helen pressed gently. Emma nodded. I found a Spanish grammar book, then French. Now I'm trying German. Words are like puzzles. Helen exhaled, half in wonder, half in fear of what such a gift meant for a child so alone. Emma, you have something rare. But that also means not everyone will understand you. Some will even fear you. Emma's eyes lowered. Like Kyle and the others. Yes, Helen said. But Jonathan Reed... I saw the way he looked at you. You shook a man who thought nothing could shake him. That is not a small thing. For a moment, silence hung between them, filled only by the muffled snores of children drifting to sleep. Meanwhile, in his glass-walled office high above Manhattan, Jonathan Reed sat alone. The city lights flickered beneath him, a galaxy sprawled at his feet. But his mind was not on quarterly reports or acquisition deals. It was on a little girl with graphite-stained fingers and eyes too wise for her years. He had replayed her words all afternoon. Your fortune will be gone in 2 years. At first, he wanted to dismiss her as a precocious child repeating something she didn't understand. But the equations in her notebook had been precise, brutally precise. She had seen a flaw his analysts had missed. Jonathan poured himself a glass of scotch, but the amber liquid didn't settle his thoughts. He remembered the way the other children laughed at her, the way she shrank back under their jeers, yet stood her ground when it mattered. He remembered her small voice saying, I read math books in the library. Who was this child? And why, after all his years building an empire, did he suddenly care? Back in Brooklyn, Emma closed her eyes, listening to the hum of the city beyond the orphanage walls. Numbers danced in her dreams, but so did the memory of Jonathan's gaze, curious, not dismissive. For once, she had not been a shadow. For once, someone powerful had seen her. And though she did not know it yet, that moment in the orphanage hall had set her life, and Jonathan's, on a path neither could imagine. Jonathan Reed was not a man who acted on impulse. For most of his career, every decision had been calculated, measured, and run through countless risk models. Yet the morning after his visit to St. Mary's Orphanage, he found himself staring at a half-written email on his laptop, hesitating over words that felt strangely personal. Helen Moore, it began. I would like to extend an invitation for you and Emma Parker to visit Reed Tech headquarters in Manhattan this Friday. Please consider this an opportunity to show her a world she may not otherwise see. He paused, fingers hovering over the keys. Why was he doing this? Reed Tech was not a playground for children. It was a battlefield of billion-dollar contracts, mergers, and competition so fierce it had left stronger men broken. Bringing an orphan girl into that space bordered on absurd. And yet, Jonathan could not forget the clarity of Emma's calculations. She hadn't guessed. She hadn't stumbled. She had seen through his slides with the cold, unflinching logic of a seasoned analyst. What's more, she had spoken truth in front of laughter and scorn. That kind of courage, Jonathan realized, was rarer than any line of code his engineers could write. With a firm breath, he pressed send. Friday morning, the marble lobby of Reed Tech buzzed with the usual rhythm of power. Polished shoes clicking across stone floors, sharp voices negotiating over lattes, screens flashing with live market feeds. Jonathan's assistant nearly dropped her tablet when she saw the unusual guests step inside. Helen Moore, in her modest navy coat, guided Emma through the revolving doors. Emma clutched her notebook against her chest like armor. Her wide eyes swept over the towering glass walls and the enormous digital display scrolling Reed Tech's stock price in real time.
"Don't worry,"
Helen whispered, squeezing her shoulder.
"Just be yourself."
Jonathan emerged from the elevators, his presence commanding attention without effort. Heads turned, voices hushed. But Emma didn't cower. She tilted her head slightly as though assessing the man behind the tailored suit, rather than the empire he represented. "Good morning, Ms. Moore." "Emma," Jonathan said, his voice warm but measured. "Welcome to Reed Tech." They followed him into the executive boardroom on the top floor, a room where decisions shaping global markets were made daily. Glass walls framed the skyline of Manhattan, the city spread out like a kingdom beneath them. Emma's eyes darted to the enormous mahogany table surrounded by leather chairs. One by one, board members filed in. They were men and women in their 50s and 60s, crisp in bespoke suits, radiating wealth and skepticism. Among them was Richard Hale, Reed Tech's vice chairman. His silver hair was combed immaculately, his smile thin as a blade. When his eyes landed on Emma, something cold flickered there. Jonathan cleared his throat. "Before we begin today's session, I'd like to introduce Emma Parker. She will be joining us as an observer." A murmur rippled around the table. An observer? A child? Richard leaned back in his chair, his lips curling in a smirk. "Jonathan, are we opening Reed Tech's doors to daycare now?" he drawled. Several members chuckled under their breath. Helen stiffened, but Jonathan's gaze silenced the room. "Emma has an unusual gift," he said firmly, "and I believe her perspective may prove useful." The meeting began. They were reviewing a proposed partnership with a Chinese technology conglomerate, Hudson Dynamics. The contract was worth hundreds of millions, promising expansion into Asia's booming digital infrastructure markets. On the surface, it was lucrative. But Emma sat quietly, her pencil moving across her notebook. After 20 minutes, she raised her hand timidly. Jonathan gave a nod.
"There's something wrong,"
she said softly, sliding her notebook toward him. Richard's laugh cut sharp through the air. "Of course. The child prodigy has found a flaw no one else has noticed?" Jonathan ignored him, scanning the notes. His eyes narrowed. Emma had circled a clause buried in the appendix of the agreement, an exclusivity provision disguised in legal jargon. If signed, Reed Tech would be barred from working with any other Asian partners for a decade. It was a trap, one that could cripple their global strategy. "Is this accurate?" Jonathan asked the lead counsel. The lawyer shuffled papers, his face paling. She's right. The clause is enforceable. If we sign as is, we're locked in." The room erupted in voices. Some demanded clarification, others cursed under their breath. Richard alone sat silent, though his knuckles whitened against the table's edge. Jonathan stood slowly, the weight of realization settling in. "Gentlemen and ladies, this 8-year-old has just prevented us from walking into a multi-billion-dollar noose. I suggest we consider her observations with seriousness." Silence followed. Emma shifted uncomfortably under so many stares, her cheeks flushing pink. She hadn't meant to embarrass anyone. She simply couldn't ignore what she saw. Richard broke the silence with a measured tone. "Impressive trick. But surely, Jonathan, you don't intend to make this..." child? Part of corporate negotiations? Jonathan met his eyes coolly. If truth and intelligence can save Reed Tech, I don't care whose mouth they come from. The meeting adjourned in uneasy tension. Reporters stationed in the lobby sniffed out whispers of Reed Tech's child genius, though nothing official was said. Helen worried as she led Emma out, her heart torn between pride and fear of the attention this would bring. Jonathan walked beside them, silent until they reached the elevator. Then, leaning slightly toward Emma, he said, "You've made powerful friends today, Emma, and powerful enemies. Remember that." Emma clutched her notebook tighter. She didn't yet understand what he meant, but the gravity in his voice made her nod. For Jonathan, the invitation he had sent on impulse now felt like destiny. For Emma, the world of glass towers had just opened its doors, though behind those doors lurked both opportunity and danger. And somewhere in the shadows of the boardroom, Richard Hale was already plotting. The ballroom on Wall Street glittered like a cathedral of wealth. Crystal chandeliers spilled light onto polished marble floors, and champagne glasses clinked in steady rhythm as New York's financial elite mingled. Outside, the city thundered with taxis and neon signs, but inside, time seemed suspended in a golden haze. Jonathan Reed stood near the edge of the crowd, his navy tuxedo tailored perfectly, his eyes restless despite the serene smile fixed on his lips. He had attended hundreds of such galas, but tonight, the weight of secrecy pressed heavier than usual. His company, Reed Tech, had barely dodged a catastrophe thanks to the sharp eyes of an 8-year-old orphan. That truth was known only to him, Helen, and Emma. But in the wrong hands, it could be twisted into something dangerous, and the wrong hands were already watching. Richard Hale moved through the room with the ease of a man who belonged to every corner of power. At 50, his silver hair and commanding baritone gave him the air of a statesman. Guests leaned in when he spoke, laughed too loudly at his jokes, and whispered about his inevitable rise. To the public, Richard was Reed Tech's loyal vice chairman, a trusted pillar beside Jonathan. In private, he was a man who craved more. He had noticed Emma Parker at once. The little girl's interruption in the boardroom, her ability to spot flaws even seasoned analysts had missed. It rattled him. It wasn't only that she had saved Reed Tech from Hudson Dynamics' trap, it was that she had humiliated him by implication. Richard had been the one to champion that deal. If Jonathan trusted Emma more, Richard's influence could unravel. Tonight, as the orchestra swelled and the elite of Wall Street toasted one another, Richard watched Jonathan from across the room. He sipped his wine, masking his simmering thoughts. An orphan girl can't be allowed to disrupt everything I've built. At the other side of the room, Jonathan's old college friend, Daniel Pierce, a venture capitalist with an irreverent streak, leaned toward him. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else," Daniel teased. Jonathan forced a smile. "You know me too well." "Word is," Daniel continued, lowering his voice, "you brought a child into your boardroom. The press hasn't gotten hold of it yet, but the whispers are everywhere." "What's going on, Jonathan? That doesn't sound like you." Jonathan hesitated. To anyone else, the truth would sound absurd. That an 8-year-old girl from a Brooklyn orphanage had protected his company. But Daniel's searching look was hard to brush aside. "She's different," Jonathan admitted finally. "She sees things no one else can." Daniel raised his brows. "And you trust her?" Jonathan's gaze darkened. "I trust the truth she shows me." Nearby, Richard had slipped into a quieter corner, where two men in sharp suits from Hudson Dynamics waited with drinks in hand. Their conversation was brief, hushed beneath the swell of the orchestra. Richard's lips curved as he listened, nodded, and tapped his glass thoughtfully. Deals made in shadows were rarely signed on paper. Back in Brooklyn, Emma was unaware of the storm brewing around her. In the dim light of the orphanage chapel, she sat at the old upright piano, her fingers stumbling through Beethoven. The sound was uneven, but her determination was fierce. Music was numbers turned into emotion, a language she was only beginning to grasp. Helen listened from the doorway, her heart both heavy and proud. Jonathan's invitation had lit something in Emma: hope, curiosity, and perhaps danger. Helen knew too well how the powerful world beyond their cracked walls could devour a child who didn't belong. The next afternoon, Jonathan stopped by the orphanage unannounced. His presence filled the modest office, his suit and polished shoes a stark contrast to the frayed carpet and cluttered desk. Helen poured tea nervously.
You shouldn't have brought her into that boardroom,
she said, her voice low.
It's too much weight for a child.
Jonathan studied her. Emma is not just any child. She saved this company from ruin. That may be, Helen replied firmly. But she's still 8 years old. She needs safety, not pressure. Jonathan leaned back, his expression torn. For years he had been a man of pure logic, measuring everything in risk and reward. Yet when it came to Emma, logic faltered. He saw a brilliance too rare to leave hidden. And he also saw the shadow of Richard Hale, circling like a hawk. Richard is dangerous, Jonathan admitted. If he realizes how gifted she is— He already does, Helen cut in. I saw the way he looked at her. You have to protect Emma, Jonathan. Promise me. Jonathan's jaw tightened. I promise. But promises, he knew, were fragile things in the world of power. Later that week, Emma wandered through the orphanage library. Dusty books lined the shelves, their spines cracked from years of eager hands. She pulled out a volume on advanced mathematics, the symbols strange yet familiar. Her lips moved silently as she read, memorizing patterns with ease. She didn't notice the man in the shadows outside the window. Richard Hale stood there, his breath fogging the glass as he watched her. He wasn't there by accident. He had arranged a discreet visit under the pretense of inspecting Reed Tech's charity work. When Emma glanced up, sensing movement, Richard smiled faintly, the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. He tapped the glass once, then vanished into the corridor. That evening, Jonathan received an anonymous tip, an email with no signature, only a sentence. Your little genius won't always be yours to protect. He closed his laptop slowly, his reflection staring back from the darkened screen. Emma's small voice echoed in his memory. Your fortune will be gone in 2 years. He wondered now whether it wasn't just his fortune at stake, but her future as well. And somewhere in the glittering heights of Wall Street, Richard Hale raised his glass to the city skyline, already crafting the next move in a game only he believed he could control. Brooklyn Elementary had never known the flash of paparazzi cameras until Emma Parker walked through its iron gates one gray Monday morning. She clutched her worn backpack against her chest, head bowed, while reporters pressed against the fence, shouting questions she barely understood. Emma, how does it feel to be the CEO's genius protege? Are you being adopted by Jonathan Reed? Is Reed Tech exploiting a child? The voices blurred into noise. Emma hurried forward, but the damage had already been done. The headline had broken over the weekend. Billionaire CEO brings orphan girl into boardroom. Though no one beyond the inner circle knew the full truth, speculation was enough to ignite the city's hunger for scandal. Inside the school, whispers spread faster than fire. She's just pretending to be smart. My mom says her kind always cause trouble. Why would a man like Mr. Reed care about her unless it's for attention? Emma slid into her seat at the back of the classroom. Her notebook open, her pencil steady, but her heart trembling. She had always been different, always the girl with too many answers, too many books. Now, instead of invisibility, she was branded with suspicion. At recess, the sting grew sharper. A circle of parents gathered outside the chain-link fence, murmuring while their children echoed their words. One mother, her pearls gleaming against a fur collar, raised her voice deliberately as Emma passed. A little orphan girl playing with CEOs? Ridiculous. What can she possibly bring to that world besides embarrassment? The words sliced deeper than Emma expected. Her throat tightened. For a fleeting moment, she wished she could erase her gift, trade her numbers for silence, just to belong. That afternoon, Helen Moore arrived early to pick her up, sensing trouble. She found Emma alone by the swings, notebook pressed to her knees, silent tears streaking her cheeks. Helen's heart cracked. She wrapped an arm around the child.
"You are not what they say," Helen whispered fiercely. "They don't see you because they don't want to. But Jonathan does. And I do." Emma nodded, though the ache lingered. Meanwhile, in Manhattan, Jonathan Reed was blindsided by the storm. His office phone rang incessantly. PR managers stormed in with frantic updates. Media outlets were demanding statements. Investors were uneasy, and whispers of impropriety crept through Wall Street. At last, he slammed his palm on the glass desk. "Enough. Draft a release. Make it clear Emma Parker is not a publicity stunt. She is a child with extraordinary talent, and Reed Tech values talent wherever it is found." His staff exchanged nervous glances. One finally spoke. "Sir, associating the company so directly with an orphan may not play well with shareholders." Jonathan's gaze hardened. "Then let them sell their shares." That evening, he made an unscheduled visit to Brooklyn Elementary. He arrived just as the final bell rang, stepping out of a sleek black car that made parents freeze mid-conversation. For a moment, the air thickened with tension. Children gawked, teachers whispered, and Emma stood at the top of the steps, eyes wide. Jonathan walked straight past the murmurs, his polished shoes striking the pavement like declarations. He stopped in front of Emma and lowered himself to one knee so they were eye level. "Emma," he said clearly, his voice carrying across the courtyard, "I hear you've had a hard day." Her chin quivered. "They say I don't belong." Jonathan's jaw clenched. He turned to the watching crowd, his voice rising so every parent, every child, every whisperer could hear. "She belongs more than any of you know. This young lady saved a company worth billions from making a fatal mistake. She saw what seasoned experts missed. And I will say this publicly here and now. I trust Emma Parker. I stand with her." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some parents looked away in embarrassment, others in disbelief. A few, touched by the raw conviction in his voice, softened their stares. Emma's tears spilled, but this time they carried relief. For the first time, someone had stood up for her, not in secret, not behind closed doors, but openly, against the weight of prejudice. Jonathan offered her his hand. "Shall we go?" She slipped her small fingers into his. Together they walked past the stunned silence, the shadow of rumors trailing behind them but powerless against the clarity of truth. That night, newspapers carried new headlines. Reed defends orphan genius in public showdown. Some mocked, some admired, but one fact was undeniable. Jonathan Reed had risked his reputation for a child no one else believed in. And in the quiet of St. Mary's, Emma lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The words of that wealthy parent still stung, but stronger were Jonathan's. "I trust Emma Parker. I stand with her." For the first time, she dared to believe she was not alone. The Reed Tech headquarters towered above Manhattan like a fortress of glass and steel. To most, it was untouchable, a citadel of algorithms, contracts, and ruthless ambition. For Emma Parker, it was something else entirely, a maze she was about to step into, armed with nothing but a notebook and the unshakable instinct to see the truth where others were blind. Jonathan Reed had made his decision. Against the advice of his board, his PR team, even his closest friends, he invited Emma to attend a closed-door meeting with the company's most powerful executives. She would not speak, only observe. Yet he knew, as surely as he knew the value of every stock in his portfolio, that she would see what others could not. Helen Moore nearly fainted when she heard the plan. "Jonathan, she's a child," she said, pacing her small office at the orphanage. "These men and women, you know what they're like. Sharks in suits. They'll eat her alive if they sense weakness." "She won't speak unless I ask her to," Jonathan promised. "I'll be at her side. But Helen, she saved us once already. If she can do it again, Reed Tech may survive what's coming." "What's coming?" Helen demanded. Jonathan hesitated. He had no proof. Only instinct and the shadow of Richard Hale's ambitions. But he said softly, "An enemy within." On a crisp Tuesday morning, Emma stepped through the revolving doors of Reed Tech once again. The marble lobby stretched endlessly above her, and digital displays tracked markets in numbers that danced like fireflies. She wore a simple dress Helen had ironed until the seams lay sharp, but she still clutched her notebook as though it were armor. The elevator ride to the top floor seemed endless. Jonathan stood beside her, tall and unflinching, yet softer when he glanced down at her small frame. "Remember," he murmured, "you're here because you see the world differently. Don't be afraid of that." The boardroom was already full when they arrived. Polished wood gleamed beneath recessed lights, and the skyline glittered through floor-to-ceiling windows. Executives shuffled papers, their conversations clipped and low. Richard Hale sat near the head of the table, his expression polite, but his eyes razor-sharp. Jonathan gestured to a chair at the corner. "Emma will observe today," he said calmly, though murmurs rippled immediately through the room. One director scoffed audibly. "What next? Bring your driver to weigh in on mergers?" Richard's smirk widened, but Jonathan ignored them all. He began the meeting with his usual composure. Today's agenda: final review of the revised Hudson Dynamics contract. The Chinese conglomerate had made concessions after Jonathan postponed the deal. But the room buzzed with eagerness. The numbers looked promising again, perhaps too promising. Emma's eyes scanned the documents projected on the wall. She scribbled quickly in her notebook, biting her lip. Words blurred, but numbers leapt into focus. Line after line, clause after clause. She saw it. Something wrong, buried deeper this time. Her hand shot up before she remembered Jonathan's warning. The room fell silent. Jonathan arched a brow. "Yes, Emma?" Her voice was small but steady. "The exclusivity clause isn't gone. They just moved it." She pointed to the appendix, her finger trembling but sure. "Page 47, Section C. It doesn't say exclusive rights anymore. It says preferential partnership for a minimum of 10 fiscal years. It means the same thing." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Richard chuckled, low and derisive. "This is absurd. A child combing through legal contracts? Are we truly lowering ourselves to this?" But Jonathan ignored him. He flipped through the document, his eyes narrowing as he found the clause. "She's right," he said, his voice slicing through the room. A lawyer leaned forward, his face paling. "Technically, preferential partnership would indeed restrict us from pursuing other opportunities without severe penalties. It's a trap, again." The room erupted. Executives spoke over each other. Outrage and embarrassment tangled in their voices. Some cursed Hudson Dynamics, others cursed Jonathan for bringing the girl. But beneath it all was the undeniable truth. Emma Parker, 8 years old,
had once more exposed what no one else had seen. Richard's mask slipped for just a second. His jaw tightened, his hands clenched under the table. He had counted on this deal moving forward smoothly. Now the girl had interfered again. Jonathan raised his hand, silencing the chaos. Emma's observations stand. We will not sign this contract. Reed Tech will not be shackled by deceptive terms. Then he turned to Emma, his tone softer. Thank you, Emma. The meeting ended in shambles. Executives filed out, whispering furiously, some casting Emma looks of awe, others of thinly veiled resentment. Richard lingered, his gaze fixed on the child with an intensity that made Helen's warning echo in Jonathan's ears. When they were alone, Jonathan knelt beside Emma's chair. You did well, he said gently. Emma's eyes filled with confusion. They hate me. Some do, Jonathan admitted. But truth makes enemies as often as it makes friends. Remember this. You are not here to be liked. You are here because you see clearly. Emma closed her notebook slowly, her small fingers tight around the edges. For the first time, she felt not only the thrill of discovery, but also the weight of danger. And across the room, Richard Hale's voice rang in his head like a warning bell. She had seen too much. Night had long settled over Manhattan, the skyline glittering like a circuit board stretched against the dark. At the top of Reed Tech Tower, the executive floor was quiet. Too quiet. Most employees had gone home hours ago. Only the faint hum of servers and the muted echo of Jonathan Reed's footsteps disturbed the silence. He should have been home himself, but something in his gut told him to stay. Since Emma's sharp eyes had once again derailed the Hudson Dynamics deal, tension within the company had thickened like smoke. Whispers lingered in the corridors, board members avoided his gaze, and investors pressed with questions that smelled less of curiosity and more of suspicion. Jonathan unlocked his office, slipped inside, and powered on his computer. He had grown up trusting numbers more than people, and tonight, numbers were the only language that could tell him the truth. Hours slipped by as he combed through files, budgets, contracts, transfers, and then, tucked deep in the research division's accounts, he saw it. Millions siphoned in small, carefully disguised amounts. A slush fund. Richard Hale's signature authorization codes were embedded in the transactions. Jonathan sat back, the realization burning cold in his chest. Richard wasn't merely careless. He was orchestrating a theft, draining Reed Tech from the inside. And worse, the money was routed through shell companies with ties to Hudson Dynamics. The betrayal was deeper than Jonathan had imagined. He reached for his phone to call the compliance team, but before he could, the screen flashed with a notification. Breaking news. His hand froze. Whistleblower claims Reed Tech manipulating data. CEO under fire. The article scrolled across his screen with vicious precision. Anonymous sources alleged Jonathan himself had tampered with research results to mislead investors. The story painted him as a ruthless executive using even a child prodigy, Emma, to cover his deception. Jonathan's pulse roared in his ears. This wasn't coincidence. Richard had struck first, planting the story to cripple him before the truth about the embezzlement could surface. By morning, the firestorm had spread. News vans lined the streets outside Reed Tech headquarters. Stock prices dipped. Journalists shouted questions laced with venom. Mr. Reed, is it true you used an orphan to manipulate your board? Are you exploiting Emma Parker for financial gain? Jonathan refused to answer. Every word would be twisted. He walked past them in silence, his jaw set, while his lawyers scrambled to prepare. At St. Mary's, the fallout was worse. Child welfare officials arrived unannounced, armed with paperwork and questions. We've had reports that Emma Parker is being used inappropriately in corporate matters. one of them told Helen Moore. This could be grounds for removing her from the orphanage for her own protection. Helen's blood ran cold. She fought back fiercely. Emma is not being exploited. She's helping. She's gifted beyond what you understand. But the officials were unmoved. They left with warnings, promising further investigation. That night, Emma overheard the conversation. Her small hands shook as she clutched her notebook. For the first time, she wondered if her gift had brought more harm than good. When Jonathan arrived late that evening, exhaustion carved lines in his face. He found Emma sitting alone on the chapel steps, knees pulled to her chest. "They want to take me away," she whispered. Jonathan knelt, his voice steady despite the chaos swirling around him. "They won't, I promise." Her eyes lifted, wide and trembling. "But they said I made trouble for you, that people don't believe me." Jonathan drew a long breath. He had spent his life building walls of steel and glass, but here, with Emma, there could be no walls. "Emma, people fear what they don't understand. And you see the world in ways they can't. That frightens them. But the truth always wins, even if it takes time." Emma hesitated, then opened her notebook. "I can prove it," she said, her small voice fierce. "If they say you changed numbers, I can show the real ones. I remember everything, every line, every figure." Jonathan stared at her, astonished once more by the clarity in her eyes. "You're just a child," he murmured. "I'm your witness," she replied. For the first time since the scandal broke, Jonathan felt a spark of hope. But it was fragile, like a flame in a storm. Richard Hale still controlled the board, the press, and the narrative. To expose him, they would need more than numbers. They would need a stage no one could ignore. Across town, Richard sipped bourbon in his penthouse, watching the news cycle unfold exactly as he'd planned. His lips curled in satisfaction as pundits debated Reed Tech's fall from grace. "She won't save you again, Jonathan," he muttered to himself. "The girl will be discredited. The company will be mine." But Richard underestimated two things: the memory of a child who forgot nothing, and the resolve of a man who had finally found someone worth protecting more than his empire. The federal courthouse in Brooklyn loomed like a stone fortress against the pale winter sky. News vans lined the curb, their satellite dishes pointed heavenward, while reporters jostled for position at the steps. Cameras clicked endlessly, capturing every angle of the spectacle. Jonathan Reed, billionaire CEO, accused of corporate fraud. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere buzzed with electricity. Lawyers in tailored suits whispered strategy, journalists filled the press benches, and ordinary citizens craned their necks for a glimpse of the fallen titan. Jonathan sat at the defense table, his face carved from granite, though fatigue lined his eyes. Beside him sat Emma Parker. The small girl in a plain navy dress, her notebook balanced on her knees, looked impossibly fragile in the sea of adults. But her gaze was steady, her pencil poised. Helen Moore sat just behind them, wringing her hands, whispering silent prayers. At the opposite table, the prosecution exuded confidence. Their lead counsel, a sharp-featured man with a voice like a blade, rose to address the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are here because Jonathan Reed manipulated data, deceived investors, and exploited a vulnerable child to cover his deception. What kind of man parades an orphan girl into boardrooms to shield his lies? You will see that Reed Tech is not just a company of innovation, it is a company of corruption." Murmurs rippled across the room. The prosecutor's words landed with venom, casting Emma as a pawn rather than a prodigy. When it was the defense's turn, Jonathan's lawyer stood, but before he could begin, Jonathan himself rose. The judge raised a brow but allowed it. Jonathan's voice carried across the chamber. "I have spent my life trusting numbers over people. But one child reminded me that numbers can be twisted, and truth must be defended. Emma Parker is not my pawn. She is my teacher. And today you will hear from her." Gasps echoed. The prosecutor smirked. "Your Honor, batibay. We cannot seriously allow a child to testify as an expert witness." The judge considered, then nodded firmly. "She may testify. Let the jury weigh her credibility." Emma walked to the witness stand, her small frame dwarfed by the wooden structure. She swore the oath with a trembling hand, then opened her notebook. The prosecutor pounced immediately. "Miss Parker, you're 8 years old. What makes you think you know more than Reed Tech's financial experts?" Emma looked at him calmly. "Because I remember what they forgot." Laughter broke in the gallery, but she ignored it. She flipped to a page in her notebook filled with columns of numbers. On January 14th, at the board meeting, the research budget was listed at $128.6 million. The next quarter, it appeared as $122.4 million, but no projects were cut. That means $6.2 million was missing. And then it happened again and again. I wrote it down each time. She pointed to the figures with her pencil. That money wasn't missing by mistake. It was moved. The prosecutor sneered. "Moved where, little girl?" Emma's eyes sharpened. "Through shell companies, with Mr. Richard Hale's authorization codes, not Jonathan Reed's." The courtroom exploded with murmurs. Reporters scribbled furiously. The prosecutor faltered, regrouped. "And we're supposed to believe you simply remembered all of this?" Emma lifted her chin. "Yes, because numbers are like music. I don't forget songs, and I don't forget numbers." Her small voice carried with eerie certainty. At that moment, Jonathan's attorney rose with new evidence. A thick folder was handed to the judge, independent audit results from Deloitte, confirming every figure Emma had cited. An investigator from the SEC followed, testifying that the funds had indeed been traced to Richard Hale's network of accounts. The tide shifted visibly. Jurors leaned forward. The gallery buzzed with excitement. Still, the prosecutor tried one last tactic. "So let me get this straight. You expect this jury to believe that a billionaire CEO is innocent because of the word of an orphan girl?" Before Emma could reply, Jonathan stood, his voice thunderous. "No. Not just her word, her proof. And if you choose to dismiss her because she is small, then you dismiss the very truth that saves us all." Silence hung, heavy and electric. The judge cleared his throat. "The witness may step down." Emma returned to her seat, her notebook clutched tightly. Jonathan leaned toward her, whispering, "You were extraordinary." Her lips trembled, but her eyes shone. "I only told the truth." Outside, cameras waited hungrily. Inside, the balance had shifted. Richard Hale, though not yet named directly, was already a man marked by suspicion. For Emma, it was the first time her gift had not only saved numbers on a page, but changed the course of justice itself. And for Jonathan, watching her walk back to her chair with dignity far beyond her years, it was the first time he realized he was no longer fighting for his company alone. He was fighting for her future. The air in Reed Tech's grand auditorium was electric. Rows of employees, shareholders, and reporters filled the space, their eyes fixed on the stage where a single podium stood. Behind it, the Reed Tech insignia gleamed against a backdrop of glass and steel. Jonathan Reed adjusted his tie, though he hardly needed the polish. The jury had spoken the week before. The charges against him were dropped, and Richard Hale had been led away in handcuffs, his face pale beneath the camera's harsh lights. The embezzlement scheme was exposed. His ties to Hudson Dynamics, undeniable. For once, truth had not only survived, it had triumphed. But Jonathan knew today was more than a corporate victory. It was a chance to write a new story. Not just for himself, but for a girl whose courage had changed everything. Helen Moore sat in the front row, her eyes brimming with pride. Beside her, Emma Parker smoothed the folds of her simple red dress, her notebook clutched nervously in her lap. She had faced courtrooms, reporters, and doubters, but somehow this moment felt heavier, a ceremony not of defense, but of recognition. Jonathan stepped to the podium. The room hushed instantly. "Reed Tech has weathered storms," he began, his voice steady. "But the greatest threat to this company did not come from the market or from our competitors. It came from within, through greed, deceit, and betrayal." A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Jonathan pressed on. That truth was uncovered not by analysts or auditors, but by a child, a girl who should have been overlooked, dismissed, forgotten. Yet she saw clearly when all of us failed. Her name is Emma Parker. Spotlights turned toward the girl in the red dress. Emma froze, cheeks flushing, but Jonathan extended his hand. Reluctantly, shyly, she rose and joined him on stage. The applause began softly, then swelled, rolling through the hall like a tide. For the first time, Emma stood not as an orphan whispered about in hallways, but as someone celebrated. Jonathan's voice softened, though every ear leaned closer to catch his words. Emma reminded me that truth is not measured by status or wealth. It is measured by courage, and it is in that spirit that I announce today the creation of the Parker Reed Foundation, a fund dedicated to supporting orphans and disadvantaged children who carry gifts the world too often ignores. Gasps followed. Then more applause, louder, rising into cheers. Emma blinked rapidly, her vision blurred by tears. She hadn't asked for recognition. She hadn't asked for anything except to be seen. And now, in front of hundreds, she was seen. Not as a burden, not as a curiosity, but as a force. Jonathan knelt beside her so the microphones could catch his words. "Emma, would you do us the honor of cutting the ribbon?" A stagehand presented a satin ribbon stretched across a stand. The scissors looked far too large in Emma's small hands, but she lifted them anyway. With one careful snip, the ribbon fell. The hall erupted in applause. Cameras flashed. For once, the chaos of the world seemed to converge on something pure. The image of an orphan girl in a red dress standing beside a billionaire who had chosen to fight for her, not against her. Afterward, reporters swarmed. Microphones thrust forward, questions flying. "Emma, how does it feel to be the inspiration behind this foundation? Do you see yourself working at Reed Tech one day? Mr. Reed, are you grooming her as your successor?" Jonathan shielded her gently with his arm. "Emma will choose her own path," he said firmly. "But wherever she walks, this company and this family will stand behind her." Helen wiped her eyes in the front row. For years, she had prayed that someone would see Emma for who she was, not for what she lacked. Today, that prayer was answered. As the crowd dispersed, Jonathan and Emma retreated backstage. Away from the glare, Emma whispered, "Why did you name it after me? I didn't do all of this." Jonathan smiled. "Emma, you saved more than just a company. You saved me. And you reminded us all that greatness doesn't come from where we start, but from what we dare to do. That name belongs as much to you as it does to me." She lowered her gaze, cheeks warm, but the corners of her mouth curved upward. For once, she believed him. That evening, as the city lights flickered alive, Emma stood at the window of Jonathan's office, gazing at the skyline. She no longer saw only towers of glass and steel. She saw possibility. Rooms she could enter, equations she could solve, music she could play. Jonathan watched her quietly, a glass of untouched scotch in his hand. He had spent decades chasing legacy, but tonight he understood legacy was not buildings or balance sheets. It was the courage of a child who refused to be invisible and the choice to protect her light. The future, for both of them, had only just begun. Central Park was alive with spring. Cherry blossoms scattered petals across winding paths, the air rich with the scent of fresh grass and the laughter of children. Just a few blocks away, in a quiet neighborhood shaded by old trees, stood a modest brick townhouse, a far cry from the cold steel of Reed Tech Tower. It was not vast or imposing, but inside its walls, something rare was taking root. Home. Jonathan Reed had never imagined himself here. For years he had lived in penthouses and suites, where silence echoed louder than any orchestra. Now, as he carried groceries into the kitchen, he could hear the faint notes of a piano drifting from the living room. Each sound carried warmth that no skyscraper could offer. Emma Parker sat at the instrument, her small frame upright, her fingers gliding over keys worn smooth with practice. The song was her own, a melody she had written on lined notebook paper, combining the logic of numbers with the heartbeat of feeling. It rose and fell like a story, simple yet profound. Helen Moore sat on the couch, knitting, her smile soft. She had agreed to stay close, helping Emma adjust to life beyond the orphanage. Her presence gave the house a sense of continuity, like roots stretching beneath new soil. Jonathan set down the groceries, pausing to listen. He leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, eyes caught by the sight of Emma's concentration. In that moment, the empire he had once chased felt distant, almost irrelevant. When the final chord faded, Emma turned, cheeks flushed. "Did you like it?" Jonathan stepped forward. "I loved it." He meant it with a sincerity that startled even him. Emma grinned shyly. "I wrote it for us. It's called Home." Silence held for a beat. Then Jonathan lowered himself onto the bench beside her. "Play it again," he said gently. "This time, let me follow along." She guided his hands to the keys, showing him the chords. He fumbled, laughed, and tried again. Their notes stumbled into harmony, awkward but real. For the first time in years, Jonathan wasn't leading. He was learning. Later that week, the adoption papers were finalized. In a quiet office at family court, a judge signed the documents, making it official. Emma Parker was no longer an orphan. She was Emma Reed. When the gavel struck, Emma's eyes filled with tears. She clutched Jonathan's hand tightly. "So, you're really my dad now?" Jonathan's voice wavered. "Yes, Emma. I always was. Now the world knows it too." Helen dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. The courtroom clerk smiled quietly, as though she knew she was witnessing something larger than law. Word of the adoption spread quickly, but Jonathan refused all interviews. This moment wasn't for the press or shareholders. It was for Emma. At home that evening, they celebrated with a simple dinner: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and apple pie Helen had baked. No champagne, no photographers, just family. Afterward, Jonathan brought out a wrapped package and placed it in front of Emma. She tore away the paper to reveal a sleek, polished piano bench, custom-built with her name engraved on the side, Emma Reed. Her eyes widened. "It's mine?" Jonathan nodded. "Yours. So every time you sit there, you'll know you belong." Emma flung her arms around him, the hug fierce and certain. In the weeks that followed, the townhouse became filled with sound. Emma practicing piano, Jonathan clumsily accompanying her, Helen humming softly as she cooked. On weekends, Jonathan took Emma to Central Park, where they read books under trees or watched street performers. Sometimes he caught her staring up at the clouds, her mind clearly lost in numbers or melodies only she could hear. One afternoon, Emma surprised him with a question. "Do you think the foundation will really help kids like me?" Jonathan glanced at her, struck by the seriousness in her tone. "Yes," he said firmly. "It's already begun. We've given scholarships, built libraries, even provided instruments for children who never had them. But you'll decide where it goes next. It's your legacy, too." Emma's face lit up. "Then I want to make sure no kid ever feels invisible again." Jonathan's throat tightened. He had built skyscrapers, but this little girl's dream felt taller than any of them. That night, as the city lights shimmered beyond their windows, Emma sat at the piano once more. She played Home again, her melody filling every corner of the house. Jonathan sat in an armchair nearby, the evening paper in his lap, though his eyes rarely left her. He didn't need headlines anymore. His future was here, in the rhythm of her music, in the simple fact that laughter now lived where silence once reigned. When the final note lingered, Jonathan whispered to himself, almost in awe, "We made it, Emma." She turned, her smile radiant. "We did, Dad." And in that modest house near Central Park, a CEO who once thought numbers were his only truth discovered that the greatest equation was family, where broken lives added together became whole, and every note of music carried the sound of healing. Thank you for staying with us until the very last note of the Orphan genius. A lonely CEO and a little orphan girl found not just numbers, but the meaning of family, healing, and hope. If this story touched your heart, we'd be grateful if you subscribed and joined us for the next journey. Your presence means more than words can say.